If you've watched this channel, you know that I'm a bit of a data center nerd, and I also love technology that reduces the environmental impact of these facilities. And with the growth of edge computing, the world needs innovation now. Hey everybody, this is Chris Brandt here. Welcome to another FUTR podcast. Today we're talking with Tom Frazier, co-founder and CEO of Redivider, a company that builds modular self-contained data center facilities that are designed to provide powerful computing at the edge. By using innovative power solutions, they are disrupting the industry while saving the planet. So let's talk with Tom about what they're doing. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks for having me on the show. Excited to be here.
Excited to have you. You know, like I mentioned, I'm a bit of a data center aficionado. I don't even know if that's something one should admit, but I do find data centers fascinating. I find infrastructure in general fascinating.
Me too.
Things that people don't always think about, or worry about. But so you're building modular data center facilities, and like the big push right now that we keep hearing from everybody is edge computing. Everybody's talking about edge computing. Can you tell us a little bit about what edge computing is, why does it matter, and why it's so big a part of what you're doing right now?
So look, I think the human brain really groks, the idea of an analogy. So let me give you one.
Sure.
10 years ago, you would think of a 1 million square foot building with this like huge internet pipe to a massive downtown building full of people, right? And so the internet was really designed to deal with these hub and spoke systems. And then when you go home at night, you've got a little tiny internet connection, and that was fine.
Right.
Now the world works remote, and it's not going back. There's high resistance, latest this week from Starbucks and Google and Amazon, of people not wanting to go back to the office. And what that means is the entire fabric of the internet finally has the opportunity for edge to work. And so what edge computing is simply a smaller data center that pushes the computing closer to the source of where that data is generated, right? So instead of taking your cell phone to a tower, to somewhere, to a data center and run a little Instagram picture and putting it back, it can now do it right next to the cell phone tower. Or if you're a factory with all these sensors, the data can stay near the factory instead of going to the air quote cloud. So edge is like a spectrum of computing, right? So some things might be like what we're doing around, purpose-built buildings, but the edge also includes things like a cell phone tower. A cell phone tower is an edge on its own because it does have computing resources up there.
There's a lot of talk about ESG, and I don't know if people really understand what ESG is, but you're playing into this environmentally forward-looking movement to try to reduce the impact of these facilities on the environment, right? Could you talk about how what you're doing really helps the environment?
To put it in context, there's been more raw data created in the past maybe 18 months than the entire history of mankind. And that is going to be completely dwarfed in the next 5 years by absolute orders of magnitude. So as data continues to increase, the consumption of data, the movement of data continues to increase, the amount of energy that's required also increases, which is pretty logical. But the creation of all the compute power also increases, which is also logical. You throw AI on top of that, and it goes, bonkers out the window. And so the data center industry at large consumes about 2 to 3% of the world's global electricity. So
that's crazy.
It's a big number. And in context, it's about equivalent to the airline industry from an emissions perspective, right? So it's a big baseload consumer. So for me, I've been in technology and data my entire career. I was literally hired right after my 18th birthday to work as faculty staff at my university, and I've been doing it ever since. The core that is Redivider's mission, or my personal mission, is I know about this space and I know that there's a lot that can be done. And now with edge computing being something that can finally take off because of the change in kind of work and workload, we humanity have an opportunity to think of it in a fresh way. How do you incorporate sustainability? And from that perspective, it comes down to power, but it also comes down to transparency, like how much carbon is being used at a data center, right?
Right.
That's not very transparent today in the market. And we're building that in from the very basic of what we started with an idea 3 years ago till now. We can tell you the embodied carbon of a single cable in a facility. Just the transparency alone is great for large customers who say, well, I'm aligning my business with these social, like sustainability development goals from the United Nations or net zero or whatever. At least we can offer some transparency on the compute side. And, so that's really where we're going is, transparency on that. And then the social impact. So operating our facilities in communities where we can increase prosperity and defined by health, wealth, and education. And so there's a lot of interesting things that can happen in the data center space. And, it starts with a blank sheet of paper.
By putting compute resources at the edge, you're not just reducing, the footprint because you're close to the generation of the data, but you're also, what you're building affords people the opportunity to actually to move the data to the people as well. I mean, it kind of cuts both ways for these underserved communities that don't have the kind of facilities that, they need to support their infrastructure. You can provide some of that.
There is not one major data center in the state of Florida. And the reason for that is environmental, right? There's hurricanes and, all kinds of crazy stuff and salt water and, the air and the humidity. Like, it's not a great environment for a data center. So if you're building a traditional facility, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars going into one building, which is a very big risk. But with Edge, you could put 100 Edge facilities and mitigate your risk because you're distributing it geographically. You're also quarantining that risk. So if one facility, gets wiped out, well, that sucks, but it's 1%. It's not 100%. So, Edge just opens up new opportunities, like you alluded to, that brings it closer to people that they don't have today.
That kind of distributed model really aligns well with the way that computing's going these days, right? I mean, back in the past, we had these big monolithic, mainframe systems, and then, we kind of shifted that paradigm. But now, the applications that we're building are containerized. They're not, they're built to be, distributed. And so that if a piece fails, another piece takes over. So you don't need to have these super high availability, solutions necessarily. You could distribute these data centers and still, use them in a fashion that if one goes down, everything still works fine, right?
If you think of it from that perspective, data customers regularly overpay because they're over-serviced, right? They're getting what they paid for, but they don't need what they paid for. They need something a lot less. And because the unit of measure is the data center, well, you get that or that's the only option, right? But now with like Edge, you can make a facility that is exactly what you need it to be and do it at a price point that, when you prefabricate it in factory, you're talking about driving out a lot of cost because you're not putting in generic 10-foot power cables. This cable needs to be 3 feet. This one's 5 feet, right? So you instantly start cutting out huge amounts of cost, and, customers reap the benefit of that.
You mentioned your prefab. I mean, so tell me a little bit about, what a Redivider facility is, because it's modular, right? And you can put in different modules based on the kinds of needs you need, right?
So Redivider is an edge data center company, and our focus is on sustainability and social impact. But to achieve those goals, we really thought deeply about the problem of, well, what are the considerations of edge, right? It means going closer to a community of people. So, well, if you're going to do that, you have to do this at scale. So the only way to do this at scale is prefabricate. For example, a classic data center is a construction crew, and it takes them 2 years to build one of these things. As things go through our supply chain, our goal, 36 months from this month, our goal is to be able to go from buying dirt to a live data center in under 30 days, right?
Wow.
And we just think that that is a game changer in terms of the major problem the industry has, which is there's only 2% capacity, folks. Like there is no capacity globally for data centers right now. And so we think we're changing the unit economics. And the way we can do that is modularity, right? We can say, well, this one needs to be 7 modules. So it might be fit on a truck. It might be 7 trucks that goes to that site.
Right.
But this other site might need to be 1 module. And like our smallest one is about 10 feet square that can go inside of a building. So if you own like, let's say a manufacturing facility, you're not a data center company. You need someone to just like solve that for you. So you can go on to and just like click buy this data center and, it just shows up and goes somewhere in your factory. So we think that modularity is the key unlock to doing this thing at scale. And once you get to scale and you go to these communities, then you can start delivering, we can start delivering on that sustainability and social impact side of things.
So you mentioned that these can go into building. I mean, this is not just purely for edge out in the country. You see all the time that companies have needs for data center facilities within, their offices, and they may not be big enough to require a huge data center, but they're big enough that they kind of need something more than you can just stuff in a closet. And, one of the challenges has always been like, you get into Class A real estate and you want to put a data center in, and then you need a generator, right? You got to put a generator on the roof. You got to get permission to put a day tank up there. You got to get the EPA, and you got to know how to, manage those power generation facilities and all that. What you're doing is kind of a different model. You have, the way you have, kind of a pre-built module that can kind of go in. There's no big retrofit that needs to happen. You're kind of bringing in all the stuff, and the power generation approach that you're taking is a little bit different than typical. Could you talk a little bit about how that all works?
It's the same basic idea around modularity. So instead of thinking of tying into the grid, which has its own set of problems in terms of cost control and what inflation is going to do to the price of electricity, as the gap between GDP growth and power capacity, that as that gap increases, buckle up, folks, power prices are going to go through the roof. So to desensitize that, but more from the sustainability side, we want to do on-site prime power wherever we can. And that means creating, not to get too technical, but creating what's called a microgrid island. So our own little mini grid that hooks up only to our facilities and can do all the kind of magic for conditioned power of a data center. And all of that gets baked into a module in the factory. So literally you would have, again, just a simple example, 1 truck delivers a data center, 1 truck delivers power generation, 1 truck delivers a kind of fuel storage tank. And now we have a data center that can be used for animating the next Disney film, for a year. And then we take it away and put it somewhere else. Or emergency response after a disaster, or a really remote location, or, the use cases unlock when you focus on the power generation alongside the data center. And we'll still plug into the grid, but, again, if you go to an area and the grid is 70% coal, well, that's not necessarily aligned with our customer base. So wherever we can, we want to do our own on-site power.
And you mentioned fuel tanks, and I know that you've got a couple things going here. So I know that natural gas is an interesting piece that you use. Natural gas is interesting because it doesn't rely on the electric grid. So if there's a failure of the electric grid, it's a pressurized system. So you still have gas flowing to your generators, but you're also doing a lot with hydrogen in some locations, and I think that's a really interesting mixture of things. Can you talk about the benefits of on-site power generation through those?
I'm very hopeful about the entire industry of hydrogen, and I think the interesting part when you think of a data center is it's a base load power customer, which just means it's always on 24/7, 365, right? So some of the other renewable energy technologies don't work well. Solar only works when it's sunny outside. Wind only works here. It's kind of like a non-dispatch system. And we think for us to be ubiquitous as an edge, we need solutions that are ubiquitous. And the cleanest option would be hydrogen. So that would be our preference. We do have some pretty amazing things happening on the hydrogen front, but in mass, I think the budget is probably 30 to 50% hydrogen, and then 70 to 50% on the natural gas, where we are doing the on-site power.
You mentioned one facility that you guys built near a river, and you're using hydrogen there. Could you talk about how that all works?
The first hydrogen-powered facility is, it's next to a river, so that water gets pulled off to be used as the kind of stock feed for the hydrogen fuel. And then that power generation drives our data center. So it's effectively an absolute zero emission data center.
That's pretty cool.
And that model is beautiful to replicate over and over and over again, because when you couple that innovation with some of the other innovations inside the data center, like immersion cooling, you've now removed the noise pollution. And you couple that with other innovations around installation without concrete, and now you've really increased that time to power for the entire data center industry. And now you layer in going into communities that are called opportunity zones, and you've now got a higher social impact envelope, and right. So as you put all these things together, it's this coalescence of like many technologies and my entire career and multiple years of many people's lives to kind of deploy this stuff in a way that we think is unshakably the future.
On-site power generation is always the big problem for everything. And like getting power to remote locations is difficult. And I know, like when you talk about some edge solutions where you would build like a little distributed, power grid with, multiple Redivider facilities potentially. It opens up a lot of interesting use cases. And we talked earlier about the emergence of 5G, for example, and the ability to bring telecommunications out to more remote areas, and the ability to put in a facility that can service these areas. There's some really interesting technologies that are sort of converging that create opportunities for really interesting things to be done, I think.
Totally right. And, whether you're talking about remote facilities or very urban facilities, the challenges can often be the same, in the sense that you go to a place, there may not be, a megawatt of power in the middle of a town, right? Unless there's a bakery that is defunct or something, it's going to be hard to find that capacity. But at the same time, the noise pollution kind of rules out a lot of the classical thinking of data centers, right? You're not going to put an airport next to a kid's school. I mean, so it's enabling on the smart city front. It's enabling on the very rural front of things as well. And, when you specifically about 5G, if you think of the way 5G works different from 4G, the antenna density is, I forgot the exact number, but it's like 7 times higher to deliver on the promise of the speed of 5G. Well, you're not going to get there unless the computing is really close to those antenna, And again, that's just another benefit of what Edge can do. And a lot of those antenna locations are not in places that have power or resources.
I've run into situations where I've been, looking at sites to build data centers, and the power reserve from a large utility just isn't there, even in large commercial real estate parks, because just there's so much consumption, and to build out that kind of power to deliver it to some of these facilities is very expensive for the utility.
And I think it comes down to alignment of incentives as well. Utility companies are generally motivated to build capacity, not consumption. And so if they build out capacity in one area, and then for whatever reason the planning went a different direction, well, you've got all this capacity over here, but you have none over here. And so that's a race condition that needs to be solved for. But I think as edge, one of the major benefits of edge, right, is people don't want an edge of one location, right? They want like a sliver of 100. And to your point before, like if you start routing your workflow and you can optimize it across an entire edge of facilities, like a network of facilities, excuse me, now your workload rules can change dramatically. I want this to be the cheapest compute. I want this workload to be the fastest compute. I want to route this one based on the carbon footprint of this job. Now the idea of workflow routing with edge becomes whatever the initiative is by the company. They can decide what they want that to be, and you can't really do that today. You get Google's cloud or Amazon's cloud, and that's it.
Thinking about this, I can imagine so many different use cases. I mean, even for companies that have a data center facility, but they need to have a facility that they can do active data replication with nearby, but not so close that if one goes down, the other does. Or, like if the power goes down in one, you don't want to have it too close because it may be on the same grid. But what you're building, you've got its own, power on-site generation. So it's not something you have to worry about. So there's a lot of different ways that this can be used. I got to imagine you've thought of a lot of interesting scenarios for these.
Definitely a lot of interesting scenarios. And, some of them, the whole point of being modular is there's no way we can know all of the scenarios. So by someone coming and saying, well, I have this other scenario. Okay, cool. Well, we can have the design team design a new module or a different version of a module to then accommodate that one thing. And, we now have a campus with 5 facilities and, this brand new 6th one for that new use case that we never imagined, and that's hard to do in a classical data center.
Tell me, what are all the modules that you offer now?
The base way to think about it is a 1 megawatt facility, right? Some of them are smaller.
Okay. That's a lot of power for a small footprint.
Yeah, so like a 1 megawatt facility depends on the rack density. So,
sure.
If it's a, let's say, medium density location, that might be 10 modules, right? Data halls, and you've got a, closet for this, closet for that, workspace, storage, whatever. But generally, our approach is kind of 2 form factors. We've got a hub location where in the United States, we're building out a network of 6 different hub locations.
Okay.
And that's where people will work. And then each of those hubs will support any number of lights out locations that will be the spokes, right? Okay. So you might have a spoke that is a geographic density solution, whereas another spoke is, one that's full of GPUs that's training AI models for rent. And another one might be, well, this one's our carbon negative platform where we've taken circular economy equipment, de-scoped from a hyperscaler, we put it back in service, and now that's carbon negative, right? So the hub is really where the staff will work, and then the spokes are smaller. So, the modules are there to support each and every one of those kind of design cases. And even where we're really starting is this idea of specialty computing. So it is the AI, computer vision, machine learning, Bitcoin mining, like all these cases where the incumbency is low and therefore the flexibility is high, and taking those into a traditional facility is probably over service and therefore too costly. So that way, by specializing in that, we're kind of unique in the marketplace. We can align with the sustainability and social impact without making an enemy of everybody. We can be an addition to the internet.
There was this great migration to the cloud, right? Especially in 2020, we saw a big push to move everything to the cloud. But I think what happened is beyond, people kind of lifting and shifting to the cloud and not seeing any economies there for sure. When their projects sort of got larger and took up more compute and storage resources, we saw that the economics of the cloud can get really hard to justify, especially as you get into scale and you're doing some of these big AI and GPU intensive kinds of things. And so we've seen this big movement to pull a lot of that stuff back on site. But, having all the multiple availability zones and things like that is something that people really enjoyed with what the cloud is offering. Having the ability to kind of drop in, locations, where you need them, and have them all owned by you and operated by you at perhaps maybe a discount from what you're getting in the cloud. I think that could be a really interesting prospect as well, right?
Just the data transfer cost in and out of the cloud is, it's small when you think about it on a megabyte scale, but when you have success, it becomes a balloon, right? It's out of control.
Right.
And so by putting an edge facility, that goes to almost zero. So even if, I think the big winner out of edge is going to be cloud edge. If you think about it just very logically, everyone loved, like you said, the flexibility of the cloud, but they don't like the cost profile when you're winning, right? No one cares when you're losing because it's zero. But when you're winning, all of a sudden it matters. And so cloud is starting to lose customers. And so all of them have a cloud edge program. And, my view on it is it's a way to keep customers. And so by carving out every single edge facility from every single vendor that's in the space, a portion of that will be cloud edge as a way for companies to keep their application stack the same as the cloud, but not have to pay the same as the cloud. And their performance is good because, again, if you do multi-AZ and now cloud is your primary and the big cloud is the secondary, okay, well, you only pay more when something's broken, and that may be fine.
Right.
But the reality is today, if you contrast that with the board initiatives of these sustainability development goals, enterprise IT performs less than half as good as hyperscalers do from a CO2 emission perspective, right? So by saving a couple dollars on IT, or maybe a couple $1 million on IT, you may be misaligning with the board objectives, which is higher sustainability, higher social impact. And so it's created this real friction. And that's where I think that's because we have an incomplete solution set as a society. And that's where, sustainable edge comes into play.
Having these independent power generation, on-site power generation capabilities and bringing that to, more of a kind of distributed electrical grid that you kind of own yourself, you could power potentially more than just your edge data center.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of potential for future use cases. Absolutely. How we would do that to power any number of things is definitely there because, we wouldn't size power generation to the consumption of a single facility, right? Because you want to cater for, like if one campus has a tier 2 facility and a tier 3 facility, well, the tier 3 has to be, N+1 and N+N for this and whatever. So the power generation will have to support the maximum layer, the maximum tier at that campus. But that means there'll be excess power for at a certain amount that we can do things with.
So I know that you've kind of built a little bit of a who's who in the world of data centers for your board of advisors. You've got definitely some heavy hitters in alternate power generation. With folks like Peter Gross, I've got to imagine that helps you serve your mission well.
You just nailed my answer. I mean, we are a mission-driven company, and by being we want to uplift humanity through computing, and by being a mission-driven company, you can really attract people who share your same core values, and we think we've done a really good job of that with some of the people in our low Earth orbit of, our advisors and things like that. So Peter Gross is, he's an amazing guy, and he's spent his career building innovative things. And, we added Mark Tersick from the CEO of Nature's Conservancy, and Stacy Schulman, who's, driving edge initiatives at Intel for, a really long time. And Mayor Suarez, what he's doing for City of Miami, and what we're trying to do for communities all around the country. So we're getting people who see the opportunity the way we see it, and we're putting this in a forum that allows us to express the importance of it, and how we're moving forward with customers, whether they be companies or governments.
So tell me, where you go next? What's the next thing for Redivider?
Well, now it's all about scale. I mean, we started the light bulb idea moment maybe 3 years ago, and when we factored in our approach, obviously prefabricated library of data center modules, sustainability, social impact. There's a lot to build there in the background, and so we've spent years doing that, and now that we've hit this moment of launch, now we're hitting the moment of scale, and really the what's next is really putting these things out in as many locations as we possibly can that align with where our customers want us to go. Because that's the other beauty is, our customer base tells us where to go. Hey, we want to be here. Help us solve this thing in Florida. Well, help us do this thing in some rural place that needs broadband. When you're modular, you can do that and just put it on a truck or a train and deliver it somewhere. So what's next is all about scale. I would like to hit, with Redivider, and when I'm at the helm, I'd like to hit thousands of these facilities to be live. And, our next major goal is to have 100. And by the time we hit our 100th, I want to make sure we're going from dirt to operating a data center in, days.
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, being able to deploy a data center in 30 days is unheard of. I mean, it's you can't even get into a pre-built facility in 30 days. By the time they set up the racks and stuff,
When you think of the model that they were doing, the power generation shows up with the microgrid, with the data center. Literally, the on-site work is like a couple days of work, and that's it. The rest is all the other parts, the zoning and the property and those kind of things. Hooking everything up is days. The last facility, I think they installed it in 2 working shifts across 2 days. So like 2 8-hour shifts.
I kind of want one in my backyard now. Could we figure that out?
I take credit card.
Yeah, I'm not sure my credit card would cover that, but
hope you have a black card.
Yeah, no, I don't. I don't have it. I have an Apple card. It's titanium. That's kind of cool. It doesn't have much of a limit on it, but well, that all that stuff is amazing. I love to see innovation in the data center space because it's such a business that needs it. I mean, so much of the data center world is run by companies that are living in the world 50 years ago, and doing things, and it's not the most efficient, and it's not easy to deploy, and technologies are difficult to make work together, and like creating this sort of modular thing that can be deployed in under a month to me sounds amazing. And if you're going to scale a business, that's a good way to do it. Have something you can deploy very fast. So
yeah, I mean, it's really a supply chain derivative business. I mean, making sure you have things like some of the lead times on items for data centers is like 75 weeks. So when you think about that from a traditional build versus a supply chain build, we've just got to keep putting orders in for parts, knowing that it comes through the supply chains to make sure that we can do all of this, and then applying innovations inside of that. So it is tricky, but it's super scalable. They're made in America. Like that, I think the other major macro trend in our kind of life, we saw globalization happen, and I think we're seeing the pendulum swing the other way with deglobalization. And so having these made in America is like an important factor. Make sure we're looking after the constituents here.
The things in building a regular, traditional data center. I remember the doors used to take the longest time. Oddly, it took forever to get the doors, because they all had to be kind of custom built, and they're heavy duty doors to prevent people breaking in. So just it's the things you wouldn't necessarily think of that just consume all your time and money.
And that's where when you kind of scratch that itch, like stay focused on the problem of edge, and you come up with some innovative solutions. So, like some of the biggest lead time items right now are air conditioning units. And if you accept switching to immersion cooling, well, you don't need the air conditioning units anymore. And you've also removed noise pollution from the equation. And now you have equipment that has higher longevity and has higher mean time between failure as well. And it is nearly silent. And you don't have the lead time problem. So like you just have to constantly interrogate your assumptions.
Yeah, there's nothing quite like standing next to some of those multi-megawatt generators with your big headphones on and just feeling them turn on and the air just gets sucked right out of your lungs. I mean, that's not frightening at all.
Yeah.
The big plumes of black smoke. Thanks so much for taking this on and building us some facilities for the future. I really love the innovation, and I'm excited to see where you go from here with this.
Yeah, well, it's been great chatting. Thanks for having me. And I look forward to the future for Redivider and edge computing in general. And I think as long as the world stays focused on the people and planet, and then profit in that order, I'm very hopeful for humanity and data centers usefulness in there.
Yes, please. If we could get people to focus in that order, that would be fantastic. Well, thanks so much for being on. Really appreciate it. And like I said, I'm excited to see where you guys go from here.
Thank you. Talk to you again.
Thanks for watching. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you could, please give us a like. And if you haven't already, why don't you subscribe? And I will see you in the next one.